Wade had not planned to stay the night, but the drive back to the city was 4 hours, and the sun was already sitting low and orange by the time he pulled off the county road onto a gravel track that led to property. The farmhouse sat at the end of it like something that had been waiting in the same spot for 100 years without moving and without being visited, and it looked exactly like that when he first saw it through the windshield. He had only learned about the inheritance 3 weeks prior through a letter from an attorney. He had never heard of representing an estate. He had no memory of being named in. The relative listed was a great uncle on his father's side, and the name meant nothing to him when he read it. His father had never mentioned a brother. There were no family stories that reached in that direction. He had almost not come at all, and had spent 2 weeks talking himself out of the drive before finally deciding that not going would bother him more than going would. The gravel crunched under his tires a way that felt too loud for surroundings, and when he cut the engine, the silence that replaced it was immediate and total. Not quiet the way the countryside is quiet at dusk. Quiet the way a room is quiet when something in it is just stopped. He sat in the truck for a moment with his hands still resting on the wheel before he got out. The farmhouse was 2 stories with a covered porch that had started to lean at the left corner, and paint that had given up the fight years ago and now showed only in flaking patches over bare gray wood. The yard had gone fully to tall grass, except for the gravel track and a narrow footpath that led around the left side of the house toward the back. He could see the edge of an outbuilding past the corner of the porch, and beyond that the property opened into fields that stretched all the way to a tree line far off in the fading light. The fields were wheat. He registered that without thinking much about it, and grabbed his bag from the passenger seat and walked to the front door. The key the attorney had sent fit the lock without any resistance, and the door swung open into a front room that smelled like dust and something underneath the dust that was harder to name. It was not rot, and it was not mildew. It was something more like grain or dry packed earth, and it sat in the back of his throat. When he breathed in and stayed there, he stood in the doorway for a moment, letting his eyes adjust to the interior dark before stepping inside. The furniture had been left in place and covered with sheets that had yellowed over many years into the color of old paper. He pulled the sheet from an armchair near the window, and a small cloud of dust rose and drifted, and he sat down without intending to and just looked at the room around him while the dust settled. The wallpaper had a pattern of small wheat stalks repeating across it in faded gold and brown, and the pattern continued into the hallway, and he could see it through the open door to the room beyond that as well. Whoever had selected it for the entire house. He sat with that for a moment. It was an unusual choice even for a farmhouse that worked wheat fields. It felt less like decoration and more like something intentional in a way he could not fully articulate. He got up and moved through the first floor carefully with his hands occasionally touching the walls as he went. The kitchen was at the back, and it still had dishes stacked in the cupboard behind glass doors and a cast iron pan hanging on a hook above the stove, as if someone had stepped out that morning and simply never returned. A wall calendar had been stopped on a month and year that was several decades past. The pages had not been torn away. It had simply not been turned. He stood in front of it for a moment, reading the month and doing the math, and then standing there with the math done and not knowing what to make of it. Something about the kitchen made him reluctant to turn his back on it, and he could not identify what that something was. It was not a sound or a sight. It was more like a pressure in a room that had no source. He turned back to the hallway anyway and found the stairs at the front of the house and took them to the second floor. 2 rooms up there were empty except for dust lying thick on the floorboards and a particular quality of silence that empty rooms hold differently than furnished ones. The 3rd room had a bed frame without a mattress and a small wooden dresser pushed against a far wall with the top drawer stuck half open. He pulled the drawer fully open and found it empty. He checked the closet behind the narrow door in the corner and found that empty as well. He stood in the center of the room and looked at the floor and was about to turn and leave when something stopped him. The floorboards in the far corner sat differently from the rest. not in color, and not in any obvious way that would catch the eye. The gap between them was slightly wider than the gaps elsewhere, as if those particular boards had been lifted at some point and set back down without the original care or precision. He crouched down and pressed the flat of his fingers along the edge of the widest gap and felt one of the boards give slightly under the pressure. He did not lift it immediately. He stood back up and went down to the kitchen and opened 3 drawers before he found a flathead screwdriver and came back upstairs and crouched down again and worked the edge of the first board up slowly. It came free without much resistance, as if it had been lifted before. The 2 boards beside it came up the same way. Underneath was a shallow space between the subfloor and the boards above it, and sitting inside that space were 6 journals of different sizes, all bound in cracked dry leather and pressed together side by side with a piece of twine looped around them and tied in a simple knot. He lifted them out carefully as a group and set them on the floor and sat back against the wall and untied the twine and held in his lap and looked at them for a moment before opening the first one. The handwriting inside was careful and old-fashioned and formal in the way that handwriting used to be, and the ink had faded to a pale brown over the years. The date at the top of the first page placed it generations back. He read for a while without stopping. The journal described the property in ordinary detail and the seasons and the work of the fields, and it was unremarkable for long stretches. And then somewhere past the halfway point it became something else. The writer mentioned the cellar door without setup or explanation, as if it were a thing already understood between a writer and any future reader. He wrote about a feeling that came over him when he stood near it for more than a few minutes. He did not describe the feeling directly. He wrote only that it was not a feeling he had anywhere else on the property. He wrote that he had decided not to use the key until he understood more about what he was dealing with. The entry that followed was the last one in that journal, and it stopped in the middle of the sentence about the week coming, that year, as if the pen had simply been set down and never picked back up. Wade set that journal on the floor beside him and opened the next one. Different handwriting, different decade, the same property described in a different voice. The same slow turn from ordinary into something uneasy. The cellar door appeared again about 2/3 through. This writer had gone further than the first. She had stood on the top step and looked down and written that the stairs did not end where they should have. She wrote that she had backed up and locked the door from outside and placed the key somewhere she would not find it easily. Her last entry stopped mid-sentence, as the others had. He read through all 6 journals on the floor of that upstairs room as the light outside the window moved from gray to deep blue to black. Each journal followed the same arc. Each one ended the same way. When he finished the last one, he turned it over in his hands and pressed his fingers along the spine out of habit and felt something there. He worked the binding open carefully at one corner and found the key pressed flat and tight against the inner board. It was old iron and heavier than it looked and cold a way that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. He held it in his palm and looked at it for a long moment. The cold did not leave the metal. From somewhere below came a sound he could not place immediately. It was low and slow and rhythmic, and it was coming from the back of the house near the kitchen. He stood and walked to the top of the stairs, and stood there and listened without moving. It was the sound of wheat brushing against the exterior of the building, long, slow passes of it against the wooden siding. He walked to the window at the end of the hall and looked out at the yard below. The tall grass in the yard was completely still. Nothing was moving. He stood at that window for a long time watching the stillness of the yard and listening to the sound continue against the back of the house. The 2 things did not reconcile, no matter how long he stood there. He told himself it was the wind moving differently at ground level than the tall grass could show, and almost believed it. He went back to the upstairs room and sat against the wall with the journals beside him and the key in his hand and thought about the drive back to the city. He thought about the attorney letter in the glove box that offered no history and no explanation for why the property had come to him specifically. The sound continued below, and the key stayed cold, and he did not drive back to the city. He spread his jacket on the floor of that upstairs room and laid down on it and stared at the ceiling in the dark and listened to the house settle and the sound outside the walls continue its slow rhythm until he was too tired to keep listening. He was asleep before he made a decision about anything. The sound outside the walls did not stop while he slept. He would not know that until morning when he woke up stiff on the floor with the key still in his hand, and the cold still in the metal, and the sound still pressing against the back of the house like it had never paused at all. He lay there for a moment, listening to it, before he opened his eyes. The light through the window was gray and flat, and the sound continued. He sat up and looked at the key in his palm. He had not let go of it in his sleep. He was not sure if that meant something, or if he was simply reading meaning into things that had no meaning. He was not sure which of those options he preferred. Wade woke on the floor of the upstairs room with the key still in his hand, and the gray morning light coming flat through the window, and the sound still going against the back of the house. He lay there for a moment with his eyes open listening before he sat up. The cold had not left the key overnight, and he noticed that first. He pressed it against his palm and held it there, and the metal did not warm the way metal should when a person holds it. He set it on the floor beside him and stood and stretched and went to the window and looked out at the yard below. The grass was still. The sound continued. He stood there for a long time trying to find something moving in the yard and finding nothing. He went downstairs and drank water from the kitchen tap, which ran rust color for a moment before it cleared, and stood at the kitchen window looking out at the back of the property. The fields of wheat ran from the back edge of the yard all the way to the tree line. They were moving in long, slow rolls going through the stalks in every direction like something passing beneath the surface. The air above the yard was completely still. The wheat moved anyway. He stood at that window for a long time before he turned away from it. He made himself eat something from the bag he had brought and sat at the kitchen table and thought about the rational order of things he was supposed to be doing. He had a call to return to the attorney. He had decisions to make about the property itself. He had 6 journals upstairs describing a door at the back of the house that every person in his family line who had ever come here had refused to explain in any useful way. He thought about driving into the nearest town and finding a diner and sitting in it for an hour among ordinary noise. He sat at the table for a while longer and then pushed back from it and went upstairs and picked up the key from the floor where he had set it the night before. He stood there holding it for a moment. He thought about what the journals had described. 6 people across 6 generations, all arriving at the same place, and all stopping at the same point, and none of them leaving behind any record of going through the door. That could mean they had chosen not to go through it. He had been telling himself that since the night before. It was also possible it meant something else. He turned the key over in his palm a few times, and then put it in his jacket pocket. He did not make a plan. He went downstairs and out the back door. The morning air was cold and damp, and the sky was low and white without definition. He stood on the back step and looked at the yard and the fields beyond and breathed the outside air, which was cleaner than inside air, but carried something of the same quality underneath it. Something like grain, but not grain. He stepped off the porch and his boots pressed into the soft ground of the yard. The morning air was cold and damp, and the sky was low and white without any definition to it. He stood on the back porch for a moment and looked at the yard and the fields beyond. Then he walked around the left side of the house along the footpath toward the back. The cellar door was set into the ground about 10 feet from the back wall of the house. He had passed it the day before without stopping. He stopped now. It was wooden and weathered and built at a low angle into the earth with an iron handle on the upper door and a latch with a padlock through it. The padlock was old iron, the same material and the same weight as the key in his pocket. He crouched in front of it and looked at it without touching it yet. The ground around the door was packed hard, and the grass near it was thin and pale compared to grass further out in the yard. He noticed that detail and stayed with it for a moment. Nothing grew close to the door in any direction. He pressed his hand flat to the wood and held it there. The wood was cold the way the key was cold, not the cold of a shaded surface, sitting in morning air, something that came from below the wood rather than from the atmosphere around it. He pulled his hand back and looked at his palm. He stood up and made himself walk away from the door. He walked the full perimeter of the house first, before he went back to the door. He needed to see the whole of the property in daylight. He needed to do something with his hands and his feet before he stood in front of that door again. The outbuilding at the side of the house had a padlock on it too, but it was a different kind, newer. He found a key for it hanging on a nail inside the back door of the house and opened it. Inside were rusted tools hanging on the walls and a careful arrangement of someone who used them regularly, and a workbench along the back wall with nothing on it but a layer of dust and a single coffee mug sitting in the center of it. He picked up the mug and looked at it. It was bone dry and had been for a long time. He set it back down and left the outbuilding and locked it again and rehung the key. He came around the far side of the house and looked at the front yard and the gravel track leading out to the county road. His truck sat where he had left it. He could get in it. That option existed. He stood at the front of the house for a moment, looking at the truck, and then walked back around to the yard. He walked to the back edge of the yard where the grass met the start of the wheat and stood there looking out at the fields. The wheat was taller than he had expected, shoulder height at least, and dense enough that 10 feet in a person would disappear entirely. It moved in those slow rolls that had no wind to account for them. He stood at the edge of it and watched the movement for a while. He told himself he was gathering information. He was not sure that was true. He walked the full exterior of the house slowly and checked the outbuilding and found it empty except for rusted tools on the walls and a workbench with nothing on it. He checked the far side of the house in the front and came back to the cellar door. He stood in front of it again. The standing in front of it was easier the second time, and he understood that was not a good sign. He was aware of himself the way you are aware of yourself at the top of something high. Not afraid in the way fear announces itself. More like the body going quiet and attentive in the way it does when it has already decided something that the mind has not caught up to. He stood in front of the cellar door for what felt like a long time. He went over the things he knew. He knew the door was there. He knew the key fit the lock. He knew that 6 people before him had stood in this same spot, and that none of their journals described what happened after. He knew the sound had been going against the house since he arrived, and that the grass in the yard had not moved once during any of it. He thought about those things and stood there in the gray morning with the damp air against his face, and the wheat moving behind him in its slow, windless rolls. He crouched down and pressed his hand to the wood of the door one more time. Still cold, still coming from below, rather than from the air. He pressed harder, as if the pressure would give him information that the temperature had not. It did not give him anything. He straightened up and reached into his jacket pocket and took out the key. He turned it once in his fingers and crouched back down and fitted it to the padlock, and felt the same quality of resistance he had felt in the front door lock when he had arrived. The sensation of the mechanism releasing from both sides at once. The padlock came free. He set it in the grass and lifted the iron handle and pulled the upper door open. It came up heavy and slow on its hinges, and he braced for the smell of cold underground air. What came up instead was warm. The smell of grain and something below the grain that was older than the grain and had no name he could put to it. He held the door open and looked down into the opening. Stone steps led down the way they should. He could see the first 3 clearly. Below, the third step the quality of light changed. It was not dark the way a cellar is dark in the middle of the day. It was bright. A warm gold that came from somewhere below that the depth of the steps could not account for. He crouched at the lip of the opening and looked at that light for a long moment. He knew the light was wrong. He knew the warmth was wrong, and the smell was wrong, and he held all of that clearly in his mind. He put his foot on the first step anyway, then the second, then the third. He stood on the third step and looked down, and what was below the fourth step was not a cellar floor. It was open air, warm gold light, and wheat running in every direction as far as he could see in any direction he looked. He stood on that step for a moment that did not feel like a single moment. His body was very still. Then he stepped through. The door swung shut behind him with a sound like a lock engaging deep in a wall. He turned around before the sound finished. There was no door behind him. There was no farmhouse. There was no yard and no footpath and no gravel track and no truck parked at the end of it. There was nothing behind him in any direction but wheat running under a sun that hung in the center of the sky without casting shadows and without moving at all. He turned a full circle slowly. Wheat in every direction, the same height, the same density, the same slow rolling movement with nothing to cause it. The sky above was the color of warm gold, and the light came from everywhere and nowhere, and there was no horizon he could fix his eye on because the wheat and the sky met without any clear line between them. He stood completely still for a moment and breathed the air, and the air was warm and tasted grain, and that older thing underneath the grain that he still could not name. The silence was complete except for the soft sound of the wheat moving against itself. He turned another slow circle and looked for the door and found nothing. He looked for the stone steps and found nothing. He looked for any break in the wheat in any direction and found nothing except a faint line of pressed earth running away from where he stood that might have been a path or might have been nothing at all. Wade stood in the wheat and turned another slow circle and breathed and tried to think clearly. The first thing he did was check his phone. He pulled it from his jacket pocket and looked at the screen, and it showed a full signal for about 3 seconds, and then the signal dropped to nothing and stayed there. He tried calling anyway. Nothing connected. He tried a text and watched it sit in the queue without sending. He put the phone back in his pocket and stood there. He thought about the steps. The stone steps had gone down and then opened outward, which meant there was a direction. There was a below and an out, and that meant the door had an orientation, even if it no longer had a visible location. He turned in a slow circle again and tried to identify where the door should be based on where he had been standing when he stepped through. He picked a direction and walked 10 steps into the wheat in that direction and stopped and looked around, and the wheat looked exactly the same in every direction. He went back to where he thought he had started and was not certain he had found the same spot. The wheat closed behind him when he walked through it and opened ahead of him and left no record of his passage. He stood still and thought about that. He had been a person who solved things methodically his whole life, and he applied that now because it was the only tool he had. The field was a space. Spaces had rules, even if the rules were not the rules he was used to. He needed to find the rules before he moved any further. The wheat did not hold impressions. The soil underneath was packed too hard. He had no way to mark his position, and no way to find a previous position once he had left it. He needed to understand the space before he moved through it any further. He stood still and looked up at the sky. The sun sat in the center of it, without moving. No shadows fell from the wheat stalks because the light came from the entire sky at once rather than from a single source the way the sun should produce. He looked at that for a long moment. No shadows meant no way to track time by the light. No moving sun meant no way to navigate by it. He looked down at his compass app on the phone. The needle spun in a full rotation, and then another, and did not settle on anything. He put the phone away and stood with his hands at his sides and tried to locate any sensation in his body that told him something about direction. There was nothing, no pull toward any particular point, no sense of gravity being anything other than straight down. The field gave him nothing to work with in terms of orientation, and it did so completely and without any gap he could find. He turned his attention to the wheat itself. It moved in those long, slow rolls, but the direction of the rolls was not consistent. They came from different directions at different moments without pattern. He stood and watched the movement for a while and found nothing in it that he could use. He became aware then of the faint line of pressed earth he had noticed when he first arrived in the field. It ran away from where he was standing in one direction only. He had not moved toward it yet, because he had been trying to find the door first. He walked to it now and crouched down and looked at it. It was narrow, the width of a single person walking. The weed on either side of it was slightly shorter and thinner, as if something had pressed it back over a long period of time. The soil in the line was not just packed, but worn in the way of path, whereas when it is used repeatedly over years. He stood on it and looked in both directions. In one direction the path curved slightly and disappeared into the wheat. In the other direction it did the same. He had no way to know which direction led somewhere, and which led nowhere, or if both directions were the same direction in a space that did not follow normal geometry. He chose one direction without a reason for choosing it beyond the fact that he had to choose something, and he stood on the path and faced that direction and took a breath and started walking. He kept his pace even. He kept his breathing even. He focused on the counting and on the path under his feet and on the wheat to either side of him, and tried not to focus on the sky above, which was the same in every direction. He looked and gave him no information at all. He counted his steps as he walked. He counted to 100 and stopped and looked back. He could not see where he had started. The path continued ahead of him and behind him, and the wheat pressing close on both sides, and the light stayed the same, and the temperature stayed the same, and the smell of grain stayed constant in his throat. He kept walking. He counted to 500 steps and stopped. He was thirsty. He had not thought about water before he came out to the cellar door that morning, because he had not planned to go anywhere. He had a half bottle of water in the outer pocket of his bag, which was sitting on the floor of the upstairs room in the farmhouse. He thought about that for a moment and then stopped thinking about it, because it was not useful. He kept walking and counting. He thought about the journals in the farmhouse and the way each writer had stopped at a certain point without explanation. He had read those stops as fear or choice. Standing in the field now, he understood they might have been something else. The pen stops when the hand that holds it has no more light, or no more will, or no more paper to write on. He was not sure which of those options he was most afraid of. He kept walking. At somewhere past 700 steps, the path curved slightly left, and then straightened, and he saw something ahead that was not wheat. It was low and dark and solid, and it sat back from the path about 20 feet to the right. He slowed as he approached it. It was a structure built from packed earth and dried wheat stalks woven together into walls about 4 feet high, with a rough roof of the same material laid flat across the top. It was small, barely large enough for a person to sit inside out of the open. The entrance was a low gap in the front wall with no door in it. He stood outside it for a moment and looked at the construction of it. Whoever had built it had used what the field provided. The wheat stalks were woven tightly enough that the walls held without any other binding. The roof was layered thick enough to block the direct overhead light. It was not a temporary shelter. It was built to last. He crouched at the entrance and looked inside. The interior was dim, but not dark. The light came through gaps in the woven walls and through a small square opening cut in the roof. The floor was packed earth. Along one wall were stacked what looked like more journals. Not 6, more than that. He counted 9 visible from the entrance, and there were likely more behind those. Beside the stack was a flat piece of dried wheat stalk pressed into the dirt as a kind of shelf, and on it sat a tin cup and a stub of candle burned down to almost nothing and a folded piece of paper. He crawled inside and picked up the paper and unfolded it. The handwriting was different from any of the journals he had read in the farmhouse. It was tighter and faster, and written with something that was not ink. He held it close to the light from the roof opening. The writing said, "I built this on the 3rd day. I stopped counting days after the 40th. If you are reading this and you came through the door, and the door is closed, and you are standing in something that does not have a name I can give you, do not go back the way you came on the path. The path loops. Start marking your steps from here. The thing that moves in the wheat is not random. It follows the path first. Stay off the path when you hear it. He read it twice and then a third time. Each line of it landed differently on the third reading. The thing that moves in the wheat is not random. He had heard something moving in the wheat since he arrived in the field, and had been telling himself it was the field itself moving. He had been telling himself that, and not examining it too closely. He folded the paper carefully and put it in his jacket pocket beside the key. He sat back against the wall of the structure and let his eyes adjust to the interior light, and looked around the space fully before he touched anything else. The floor was packed earth-worn smooth. The walls were tight enough to block the wind that did not exist outside anyway. It was drier inside than the open field, and the smell of grain was less strong here. He was not sure if that was because the walls blocked it or because the structure itself was old enough to have absorbed it fully and become neutral. He looked at the stack of journals. He picked up the first journal and opened it. The handwriting inside was careful and precise, and controlled in a way that felt deliberate, like someone who had decided that their handwriting would not show what they were feeling regardless of what they were feeling. The first entry was dated not with a calendar date, but with a number. Day 1. He read, "I went through the door this morning expecting a cellar and found a field instead. I have walked the perimeter as best I can determine. There is no perimeter. The sun does not move. The air is warm and does not change. I am not injured. I am thinking clearly. I am writing this because if I came through, then others can come through. And I want whoever comes next to find something here that tells them they are not the first. My name is Della. I have been in places that wanted to be rid of me before, and I am still here. I intend to remain that way." He read the first entry again, and then turned to the second entry, and then stopped and set the journal down on his knee. He needed to read all of them, but not here and not right now. He needed to think about the note first. He needed to think about what it meant that someone had built this structure and filled it with journals and left a note for whoever came next and had known someone would come next. He needed to think about what kind of knowledge that was and where it came from, and what it implied about the field and the door and the farmhouse and his family, and the 6 journals under the floorboards that all ended the same way. He sat with all of that for a moment in the dim interior of the structure, with the packed earth under him and the woven walls around him. Then from outside came a sound he had not heard since he arrived in the field. It was low and rhythmic, and it moved through the wheat from somewhere he could not locate. It was not the sound of wheat moving against itself. It was something else inside the wheat, moving slowly, coming from the direction of the path he had just walked. Wade did not move when the sound started. He sat against the wall of the structure with the journal on his knee and listened and let the sound define itself before he reacted to it. It was low, and it moved through the wheat in a way that was different from the way the wheat moved on its own. The wheat moved in rolling waves that came from all directions without pattern. This moved in a line, a single direction, steady and unhurried, and coming from somewhere back along the path he had walked to get here. He set the journal down carefully on the stack and got his feet in a low crouch and moved to the entrance gap and looked out without putting his head past the wall. The wheat outside the structure was moving the way it always moved, but further out along the path, there was a different quality to the movement. The stalks were parting and closing in sequence. Something was passing through them. It was not visible. Only the displacement was visible. He watched it for a moment and then pulled back inside. He thought about the note. The thing that moves in the wheat is not random. It follows the path first. Stay off the path when you hear it. He looked at the gap in the wall and the path visible through it. The structure sat about 20 feet off the path. He had walked those 20 feet through the wheat to reach the entrance. He was off the path. He stayed still and kept listening. The sound continued, and then passed, and the displacement he had been tracking through the wheat moved along the path and continued in the direction he had come from, and eventually the sound faded back into the general movement of the field, and he could not locate it anymore. He stayed inside the structure for a long time after it was gone. Then he picked up the journal stack and began to read. Della's journals were not like the journals in the farmhouse. The farmhouse journals were written by people who were managing fear around something they had not yet encountered directly. Della's journals were written by someone who had encountered it and kept going. Her early entries were methodical in a way that told him something about who she was before he knew anything else about her. She cataloged the field the way a surveyor would catalog a site. She had been hired to map. She wrote without editorializing and without panic, and without the kind of hedging language people use when they're not sure whether what they're describing is real. She described it as real because it was real, and she appeared to have settled that question for herself very quickly and moved on to the work of understanding it. She recorded the temperature, which did not change. She recorded the quality of the light, which did not change. She recorded the movement of the wheat and her attempts to find a pattern in it, and her conclusions when no pattern emerged. She noted the absence of insects. She noted that her shadow was very faint because the light came from everywhere rather than from a fixed point. She noted that the wheat stalks, when broken, produced a sap that dried clear and was slightly sweet. She recorded all of it without judgment. She recorded what she ate in the first days, which was what she had in her pockets when she came through the door: a protein bar, a handful of nuts, a stick of gum she made last longer than it should have. She recorded her thirst and the moment she discovered that the packed earth of the path, when dug up a few inches, held moisture. Not clean water, but moisture she could collect slowly by pressing cloth against it and squeezing. She had come through with a bandana in her back pocket, and she described the process of using it to collect moisture with a precision that made it clear she had refined a method over multiple attempts. He read that entry and looked at his own jacket and thought about the inner lining, which was a thin cotton layer he could separate from the outer shell if he needed to. He thought about that with a particular focus of someone who was trying to stay practical and not think about how long the word need implied. Her journal from day 6 was the first mention of the sound. She described it the same way he had experienced it: low and rhythmic, and moving through the wheat in a line. She wrote that she had been on the path when she first heard it and had stepped off in time. She wrote that she had watched it pass and that she could not see what made it, only the displacement of the stalks. She wrote that she had tried to observe it from a distance on 3 separate occasions, and that on the 3rd occasion it had changed direction while she was watching and moved toward her position, and that she had moved away before it reached her. She wrote, "It does not hunt by sight. I am not certain how it hunts. Be aware of your breathing when it is close." Her handwriting did not change when she wrote that. It stayed controlled and even. He found that more unsettling than anything else he had read so far. Fear that has been fully absorbed into the handwriting is more frightening than fear that is visible in it. He set that journal down and held it for a moment before picking up the next one. He was aware that he was reading about a person who had survived in this field for a long time, and that the journals existed because she had stayed long enough to fill them. He did not examine too closely what that implied about the nature of the time she had spent here. He read through the middle journals more quickly. She mapped the field as best she could. She established that walking in any direction for a long enough time eventually returned her to a position near the structure, which suggested the field had a boundary, but not one defined by walls or edges. It curved back on itself. She wrote about the quality of sleep in the field. She wrote that sleep came, but that it felt shallow, and that she woke from it uncertain how much time had passed because the light never changed. She developed a system of marking the packed earth near the structure each time she woke to track her sleep cycles. She drew rough diagrams in the margins of the journals, showing her attempt to understand the geometry of the space. None of the diagrams resolved cleanly. She wrote on day 22, I think it is not a space at all in the way I have been understanding space. I think it is more like a condition, something the field does rather than something the field contains. On day 31, she wrote about the exit point for the first time. She had found it by accident. She had been moving off the path to avoid the sound and had pushed deeper into the wheat than she usually went and had come to a place where the light was slightly different. Less gold, more white. She described it as a seam, a place where the field met something else. She had not gone through it that day. She wrote that she needed to understand more before she moved toward it again. She wrote that the sound had been closer that day than any previous day, and that she believed the field contracted around her when she stayed in one location too long. She had been near the structure for too many consecutive days, and she was going to begin moving. The last journal in the stack picked up from a point that was clearly later. The handwriting was the same, but the entries were shorter, less cataloging, more observation. She wrote, "The field feeds on stillness. Keep moving." She wrote, "The exit point is real, but the field will not release both of us. I have tested this. I do not fully understand the mechanism, but I have tested it enough to be certain." She wrote, "I have been here long enough that some things have changed in me. I notice it in my eyes more than anything else. If you are reading this, come find me. I am deeper in. Follow the secondary path off the main one at the place where the main path bends left. The secondary path is harder to see. Look for where the wheat is shorter on the right side." He set the last journal down and sat in the structure with all that settling over him the way cold water settles over a person who has just stepped into it. He thought about the exit point. He thought about the phrase, "The field will not release both of us," and what testing that looked like for a person alone in a field with no one else present. He thought about what she had needed to learn in order to be certain about that. He thought about how long certainty like that takes to arrive, and what the time between the hypothesis and the certainty would have felt like from inside it. He thought about the difference between a person who writes, "I think," and a person who writes, "I have tested this," and he understood that the distance between those two phrases in Della's journals represented a very long time. He thought about her eyes, and what she meant by "some things have changed in me," and why of all the things she might have named, she had named her eyes. He filed that and did not unfold it. He picked up the journals and stacked them back carefully the way he had found them, and set the folded note on top of the stack, in case someone else came after him and needed it. He looked at the entrance gap and the wheat outside moving in its slow, windless rolls, and thought about the direction of the secondary path she had described. He thought about the sound and where it was now. The field was quiet the way it was always quiet except for the movement of wheat against itself. He thought about what she had written about staying too long in one location. He thought about the fact that he had been sitting in this structure for what felt like an hour. He got up and crouched at the entrance and looked out in both directions and listened for a long moment. He thought about the fact that she had been moving through this field long enough to fill 9 journals and had survived it and was still here. He thought about the fact that she had specifically written, "Come find me." She had left that note knowing someone would eventually come to the door and find the structure, and read everything she had left. She had been waiting for this. He did not know what that meant for him yet, but he knew it meant he was not alone in the field, and that she knew more than he did, and that the secondary path went to the right off the main bend. He was not sure what he would find when he got there. He was not sure what changed in a person after enough time in a place that fed on stillness and contracted around you and sent something through the wheat on a path toward wherever you were standing. He filed that question away the same way she had taught him to file things, just by the way she wrote. He went out into the wheat and crossed the main path and turned toward the bend and started walking. He kept his steps even and his breathing quiet and his ears on the field around him, and he did not look back. Wade found the bend in the main path after about 400 steps and stopped and looked to the right the way the last journal had described. The wheat there looked the same as the wheat on the left side of the path, and behind him and ahead of him. He stood at the bend and looked at the right side for a long time, and then he saw it. The wheat stalks on the right were shorter by a few inches in a narrow strip that ran away from the path at a slight angle, not noticeably shorter unless you were looking for it. He stepped off the main path to the right and pushed into that strip and felt the ground under his feet shift from packed path to something slightly softer and found the secondary path beneath it. It was fainter than the main path, narrower, but it was there and it went somewhere. He followed it. He walked for a long time on the secondary path without counting steps because the counting felt less useful now that he was following something rather than moving without a reference point. The light did not change. The temperature did not change. The smell did not change. He thought about Della's journals and the way she had described a field as a condition rather than a space. He thought about what that distinction meant practically. A space has walls and a floor and a ceiling and an outside. A condition has none of those things. A condition is something that happens to you rather than somewhere you are. He thought about that distinction while he walked and found it mattered more the longer he stayed with it. The secondary path curved right and then left and then straightened, and he followed it and then he stopped. Ahead of him through the wheat was a structure larger than the first one, considerably larger. It had the same construction of packed earth and woven wheat stalks, but it rose higher, and the walls were thicker, and there were two sections joined at an angle with a covered space between them that functioned like a narrow courtyard. The wheat around it had been cleared back about 10 feet in every direction, and the cleared ground had been packed flat and marked with lines scratched into the earth that he recognized from the margin diagrams in Della's journals. Maps, partial and unresolved, but maps. He stood at the edge of the cleared ground and looked at everything she had built and felt something shift in his understanding of what this field was and what it meant that a person could survive in it long enough to build this. The first structure had been a shelter, a first response. This was something a person builds when they have stopped waiting to be rescued and started building a life in the place they are in. He stood with that for a moment and felt it the way you feel a door closing that you did not know was still open. Then he looked at the entrance to the structure and said her name once at a normal speaking volume. Nothing moved. He said it again. A figure appeared in the gap between the two sections of the structure and looked at him. She was standing still, and she was looking at him with an expression that was not surprise. It was closer to confirmation, like a person who has been expecting a particular outcome and is watching it arrive. She was tall with a lean quality that was not thinness exactly, but the particular build of a person who had been moving and working continuously for a long time. Her hair was cut short in a way that suggested she had cut it herself without a mirror, using whatever edge she had available. She wore clothing that had been repaired multiple times with strips of dried wheat stalk fiber and what looked like torn fabric from a shirt that was no longer being used as a shirt. She looked at him for a moment longer and then spoke. She said, "You read the journals in the house first." He said yes. She said, "And then the ones in the small structure." He said yes. She said, "How long have you been in the field?" He said it felt like most of a day. She nodded slowly at that in a way that suggested the answer meant something specific to her, that she was not going to explain immediately. She studied him for a moment, longer the way a person studies a situation they've been preparing for and are now confirming the details of. Then she said, "Come inside." The interior of the larger structure was more developed than the first one. There was a sleeping area marked by a low platform of packed earth with dried wheat laid over it. There was a working area with flat stones arranged as a surface and tools made from wheat stalks and compacted earth sitting on them. There was a section of wall covered in scratched writing too dense to read quickly. She had been here long enough to build all of this and to use it long enough that it had the worn quality of a place that is lived in rather than constructed. He followed her inside and looked around the interior fully before he sat. He looked at the sleeping platform and the working surface and the tools and the wall of scratch writing. He tried to read some of the writing, but it was dense and layered, and some of it had been written over previous writing, and he could not pull a single coherent passage from it quickly. He looked at all of it and thought about the time it represented, and then sat where she indicated. She sat across from him on a low section of packed earth and looked at him with those eyes he had first noticed from the edge of the cleared ground. The irises were the right color. The pupils were the wrong shape, not dramatically wrong, slightly elongated in a way that caught the light differently. He looked at them, and she let him look without explaining. She said, "It happened slowly. I noticed it around day 60. She said the way she wrote in her journals, without editorializing. He asked her how long she had been in the field. She was quiet for a moment and looked at a spot on the floor between them. Before she looked back up, she said, "Long enough that I stopped using days as a measurement." He waited to see if she would say more. She did not. She moved on to the exit point as if that answer was complete, which told him that the number was either very large or that she had decided the number was no longer useful information. He asked her about the exit point. She picked up a piece of flat wheat stalk from the working surface and showed him a diagram. She had scratched into it. The exit point was marked with a small circle about 2/3 of the way across the diagram. The field structure was drawn around it in the curved geometry from her journals. She explained it the way she wrote in her journals, without preamble and without softening the information before she delivered it. The exit point was a seam in the field, a place where whatever the field was met, whatever was outside it, and the boundary between them was thinner than elsewhere. She had found it twice before the first time, and the second time had been accidental, and she had nearly gone through before she understood what it was. She had spent a long time after that learning to approach it deliberately under controlled conditions. The seam opened under specific conditions she had identified through repeated careful observation. When it opened, a person could pass through it and come out somewhere near the farmhouse. She confirmed the destination by pushing objects through and later finding them just inside the cellar door on the farmhouse side. Small things, a piece of packed earth pressed into a shape she could identify, a strip of cloth. She described the process of pushing something through the seam and the resistance she felt from the field when she did it, like pressing through a membrane, like the field knew something was leaving and considered whether to allow it. She said the field always allowed the objects. It was people the field had opinions about. She paused there and let him understand what that implied. She had found a way to pass objects through, but had not gone through herself. He asked why. She set the diagram down and looked at him directly and said, "Because the field holds the exit open by taking something in return. When I approach the exit point alone, the field contracts hard around me, and the sound comes every time, without variation." She said, "I have been close enough to the seam to feel the other side of it. The air on the other side is cold, and it smells like stone and earth, and it is the most specific thing I have felt since I came through the door." She paused and then said, "The exit stays open long enough for one person to pass through. The field will let one of us go." He asked her how she knew it would not let both of them through if they moved together. She looked at him for a long moment before she answered. She said, "Because I tried it once before. Someone else came to the door about a year after I arrived." She stopped there. He waited. She said, "We reached the exit point together. The field closed around us when we were both close to it, and the sound came from every direction, and not just along the path." She looked at the wall covered in scratched writing. She said, "I made it back to this structure." He did not ask about the other person. He understood from the way she had stopped speaking in the middle of the sentence and then reoriented and continued from a different angle that the answer was not one she was to give him directly, and that understanding the answer was not necessary for what came next. He understood the shape of what had happened without the details, and the shape was enough. She looked back at him, and her elongated pupils caught the light, and she said, "I am not going to tell you who stays. That is not a decision I will make for you. But I need you to understand that it is a real decision, and it is the only decision that matters now. Before he could answer or fully sit with what she had just handed him, the sound started outside. It was not coming from the path the way it always had before. It was coming from multiple directions at the same time, and it was closer than he had heard it even at the first structure, and the walls of the larger structure shuddered inward slightly the way walls shudder in a high wind, and then held. The woven wheat stalks groaned once and were quiet. Della looked at the nearest wall with an expression he recognized from her journals. Not fear. Assessment. She was calculating something. She looked back at him, and her pupils caught the overhead light, and held it, and she said, "It knows we are both here, and it has been waiting for that. We have been here too long already." She stood and moved to the entrance and looked out, and then turned back and said, "The exit point is not far from here, but we have to move now, and we have to move through the wheat not on the path. Stay behind me and match my pace, and do not stop for any reason until I stop." Wade followed Della out of the structure and into the wheat, and the sound was everywhere. Not loud, but present in a way that had no single source and no single direction, and that quality made it worse than loud would have been. Della moved through the wheat without using the path, and she moved fast and low and with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done this many times. He matched her pace and kept close, and the wheat closed around them both as they pushed through it, and the sound moved with them at the edges of his hearing. He focused on the back of her head and her shoulders and the rhythm of her movement, and he did not look to the sides. The field around them was doing something he had not felt it do before. The temperature dropped slightly. Not much. Enough to notice. The light shifted in a way that was hard to describe. It was still gold, but it had a quality of pressure to it now, like the air before a storm in the sky has not yet changed, but something in the atmosphere has already decided what is going to happen. Della stopped, and he nearly walked into her back. She was looking at something ahead through the wheat. He looked past her shoulder. The wheat in front of them was moving differently from the wheat on either side, not in a rolling wave pattern, but in a slow, consistent press, as if the stalks were leaning away from a specific point ahead and to the left. She watched it for 3 seconds and then changed direction without a word and angled right, and he followed. The sound shifted with them, still at the edges, still that quality of patience that was more frightening than urgency would have been. They pushed through the wheat for another long stretch, and then Della stopped again, and this time she did not look around her. She was looking down. He looked past her and saw it. The seam. It was not dramatic. It was a place in the field where the light was different. A narrow band, maybe 4 feet wide, where the gold of the field shifted to something cooler and whiter, and the air above it shimmered faintly the way air shimmers above hot pavement. It sat in the wheat without any border around it, and without any marker other than the quality of the light itself. He could feel it from where he was standing. Not warm from it, but the absence of the field's warmth. A pocket of different air. It smelled like stone and cold earth, and underneath that something that was almost familiar. He thought it might be the smell of the farmhouse cellar. The smell that had come up from the stone steps when he opened the door. Della stood in front of it and looked at it, and then turned to face him, and they stood in the wheat with the sound circling at the distance it had held since they left the structure. She said, "I need you to listen to me before we talk about what happens next." He said he was listening. She said, "The field has had me for a long time, long enough that the things that have changed in me are not going to change back." She said it plainly the way she said everything. He looked at her eyes. The pupils in the field's gold light were more elongated than they had been inside the structure. She said, "I know what I look like. I know what it means." She said, "I am not going to tell you to go through, and I am not going to tell you to stay. What I'm going to tell you is that I have been watching the seam for a very long time, and I know how it works, and I know what the field does when someone approaches it, and I need you to understand something before you make a choice." He waited. She said, "The field does not want me anymore. It has had me long enough that I am no longer what it is looking for. The sound follows you now. It has followed you since you came through the door, and it followed you to my structure, and it is following us now." She looked at him steadily. She said, "You are what it brought here. You are what it was holding the door open for." He stood with that for a long moment and let it settle, and then let it unsettle, and then let it settle again. He thought about the key pressed into the spine of the last journal in a way that only someone who read all the way through would find it. He thought about 6 generations of his family arriving at this door and stopping and none of them going through, and what it meant that the farmhouse had been passed down in a line that ended with him. He thought about the attorney's letter with no history and no explanation for why it had come to him specifically. He thought about the word specifically and what specific meant in the context of a field that waited and a door that opened and a key hidden for whoever was meant to find it. He thought about his father who had never mentioned a brother. He thought about what his father might have known and chosen not to say. He said, "You are telling me this was always going to be me." She said, "I am telling you what the field has shown me over a very long time. I am not telling you what to do with it." The sound moved closer. It was still circling, but the radius had tightened and the temperature dropped another degree, and the light pressed down with more of that storm quality. He looked at the seam and the cold air above it and thought about the farmhouse on the other side of it and his truck on the gravel track and the 4-hour drive back to the city. He thought about Della and her journals and the other person she had not told him about and the structure she had built and lived in for longer than she would measure. He looked at her for a moment and then away at the seam and then back at her. He thought about what she had written in the last journal. "Come find me." She had written that knowing someone would come through the door and find the structure and read everything she had left. She had been preparing for this specific moment for a long time, and she was standing in it now with her changed eyes and her rebuilt clothing and her journals full of things she had survived, and he thought about all of that and said, "Come through with me." She looked at him for a long moment, and something moved across her face that was not any expression he had a clear name for. Not hope exactly, not refusal exactly. Something between them that had been there a long time and had learned to hold very still. She said, "I already told you what the field will allow." He said, "You told me what happened before." She said, "Yes." He said, "Then we move at the same time, and we move fast, and we find out." She looked at the seam and then back at him, and the sound tightened another degree, and the wheat behind them parted with a dry, tearing sound that was nothing like the wheat moving on its own. She said, "Move now." They moved together. He hit the seam, and the cold air came over him like stepping through a curtain of water, and the gold light died, and the smell of grain died, and he was on stone steps in the dark, and the air was cold and damp and tasted of earth, and he was moving up, and he hit the outside air and stumbled onto the packed ground beside the cellar door and went down on one knee and stayed there for a moment breathing. The sky above him was gray, and the grass in the yard was moving in actual wind, and the farmhouse was behind him solid and real, and he could hear birds somewhere off toward the tree line. He got up slowly and turned around. The cellar door was closed. He stood beside it and looked at the yard and the farmhouse and the gray sky above and breathed the real air, which was cold and tasted of nothing but cold. He looked at his hands. They were shaking slightly, which he had not noticed while he was moving. He pressed them flat against his thighs and made them stop. He looked at the cellar door and then at the ground around it, the pale grass, the packed earth. He waited for something to follow him through. He said her name. Nothing moved. The field under his feet was quiet with the quiet of a real yard in real wind. The sound was gone completely. The cold that had been in the key since he arrived was gone from his pocket. He reached in and took out the key and looked at it. It was room temperature for the first time. He reached down and took the padlock from the grass where he had left it and fitted it back to the latch and pressed it closed without using the key. He stood there for another moment, and then he walked to the back door of the farmhouse and went inside. He went through the kitchen and down the hall and stopped in the doorway to the front room. Della was standing at the far window with her back to him, looking out at the front yard and the gravel track, and his truck sitting at the end of it. She was still. Her posture was different from how she had moved in the field. More still, the kind of still that is not rest. He said her name. She did not answer immediately. She turned slowly, and he looked at her face, and the light from the window fell across it, and he saw her eyes, and the pupils in the gray daylight of the real world were not slightly elongated the way they had been in the field. They were fully changed, split top to bottom like something that does not belong in a human face. She looked at him with those eyes for a long moment, without moving and without speaking, and the silence between them had a quality that was different from the silence of the field, but not entirely different. Then she smiled, and the smile reached the right muscles in the right sequence and produced the right shape, and it was almost right in every way except that it arrived a half second after it should have, and he felt that delay in his chest before he understood what he was feeling. She said, "I told you what the field would allow." He stood in the doorway and held what he was looking at and let the understanding arrive at its own speed, which was not slow. It had sent something back wearing her face, and it had been standing at the window, looking out at the world it had just been given access to, and he was the one who had opened the door, and he was the one who had brought it through, and the key was in his pocket, and the padlock was closed on the cellar door, and none of that mattered at all, because whatever had come to the scene with him was already inside the house, and it was between him and the only way out.